My name is Arthur Callahan, and I am 76 years old. I used to think I was buying the world when I'd wash that freezing mud from between my fingers and stare at the yellow dust shimmering at the bottom of the pan. I thought I was holding the future, but what I was sifting out in that riverbed wasn't dirt. It was my son Leo's childhood, my wife Martha's youth, and my own damn life. It took emptying my pockets completely, losing everything that actually mattered, and meeting the lonely, broken man staring back at me in the mirror to finally understand that. Before I tell you how I traded my entire world for a handful of gravel and crawled my way back from the absolute bottom, subscribe to the channel. This isn't just a story. It's a testament to surviving life's hardest blows and the brutal cost of obsession. The late 1970s in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada possessed a specific kind of cruelty. It was a beautiful, sprawling kind of ruthless that tricked a man into thinking he could conquer it. The pines stood like ancient sentinels along the ridges, indifferent to men who crawled around their roots like ants, scratching at the dirt for a glimmer of salvation. I wasn't just a man back then. I was a vessel for a sickness, a quiet, consuming infection of the mind. We called it the fever. It didn't start with a bang. It rarely does. It starts as a whisper in the back of your mind when you hold that first jagged flake of gold. You feel the unnatural weight of it, the specific gravity that makes it sink through the black sand at the bottom of the rusted pan, and something inside your chest shifts. The geometry of your life rearranges itself. You start believing that the earth owes you something, that there's a secret pact between your sweat and the bedrock. 80 miles away, down in a valley where the air didn't bite your lungs and the ground wasn't frozen solid for half the year, I had a home. I had Martha. Even now, after all these decades, I can still remember the smell of her kitchen, a warm, enveloping sanctuary scented with yeast, roasted chicken, and the cheap lavender soap she used to scrub her hands at the sink. I had a son, Leo. His little boots used to make a hollow, rhythmic thud against the worn wooden floorboards of our porch. They were a living, breathing paradise, a quiet heaven that most men spend their entire lives breaking their backs on factory floors to build. And I took a pickaxe to it. I traded the steam rising from a porcelain bowl of Martha's hot stew for the metallic, tinny taste of cold beans eaten out of a den can by a sputtering, smoke-choked campfire. I traded the soft, steady weight of my wife sleeping beside me for the jagged, damp embrace of a canvas sleeping bag laid over roots and jagged shale. I convinced myself I was doing it for them. That was the great, poisonous lie I fed myself every morning as I waded into water. So cold it felt like a tourniquet tightening around my calves. I am providing, I would tell myself, shivering violently as the gray dawn broke over the tree line, my breath pluming in the freezing air. I am going to make us kings. I am going to buy them a life where they never have to worry again. But the truth is, you don't stay in freezing snowmelt until your hands turn white, then a bruised, mottled purple, just for your family. You don't ignore the aching joints and the persistent cough that rattles in your chest just to pay the mortgage. You do it because the sickness has taken root deep in your marrow. I would stand in that river for 10, 12 hours a day. The physical labor was a slow, deliberate dismantling of the human body. The ache in my lower back became a constant companion, a dull roar that never quieted, even when I finally lay down on the hard ground. My hands grew thick and monstrous, the skin splitting at the knuckles, packed tight with dark silt and oxidized iron that no amount of scrubbing with river sand could remove. I smelled perpetually of wet earth, wood smoke, and stale sweat, but I didn't care. Every shovelful of gravel thrown into the sluice box was a lottery ticket. Every swirl of the pan was a desperate prayer to a god that lived underground. We are taught one of the most dangerous myths from the time we are boys sitting in classrooms. If you work hard enough, if you dig deep enough, the world will eventually yield its rewards. But the earth is not a meritocracy. The mountain doesn't care how hard you swing the pick. It doesn't care about your bleeding blisters or the unpaid bills back home, or the way your wife looks out the window, watching the driveway for a rusted Ford truck that never seems to arrive. The dirt is completely, utterly indifferent. It will take your sweat, your blood, and your youth, and it will offer absolutely nothing in return unless it simply happens to. I spent my best years hunting phantoms. I was always just one rock away from a mother lode, just one more bend in the river, Just one more crevice in the bedrock. Just one more week before the winter frost set in and froze the ground solid. And while I was busy decoding the geology of the riverbank, measuring the drop of the sluice, and sifting to the tailings, the real gold, the minutes, the hours, the years of my son growing up, was flowing right past me, washing downstream into an ocean of lost time. I remember coming home after a month in the high country. My beard was matted, my flannel shirt stiff with dried mud. Martha didn't ask how much I found anymore. She had stopped asking a long time ago. She just looked at me with a quiet, hollow resignation, set a plate of food on the table, and went upstairs to put Leo to sleep. I ate in silence. The quiet of that small house was ringing in my ears, deafening after the constant, rushing roar of the river. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. Yet, as I sat there, staring at the faded pattern of the linoleum floor, my mind wasn't on my son sleeping upstairs, or my wife's tired eyes. My mind was already tracing the topography of the next claim. I was physically sitting at my own kitchen table, but my soul was still up there, buried under 6 feet of Sierra mud. The mountain gave me just enough hope every time. Never enough to make me rich. Never enough to change our lives. Just a few grams of dust. Just enough to keep the fever burning. Enough to ensure I'd pack up my truck, turn my back on my front door, and return to the cold. But if I had known that day I struck my first pickaxe into the soil exactly what the mountain was really going to tear away from me, I would have never put my hands in those waters. By the time the 1990s bled into existence, the Sierra Nevada had stopped feeling like a frontier of boundless opportunity and had become a sprawling, unforgiving tomb. The years had not just passed. They had been ground down into dust, pulverized by the rhythmic, mindless swing of my pickaxe. The grand, shimmering motherlode, the vein of pure, uninterrupted gold that was supposed to justify every frozen morning and every broken fingernail, remained exactly where it had always been, exclusively in my fevered imagination. The decay of a man's life rarely happens all at once. It is a slow rot, an erosion of foundations that you ignore until floorboards collapse beneath your boots. The signs were there, printed in sharp black ink on heavy white paper. The bank notices arrive with an escalating, rhythmic frequency. First, they were polite reminders about the mortgage on our cabin. Then, they were stern warnings. Finally, they came in envelopes stamped with bright red lettering that screamed final notice. I remember holding those letters in my thick, deformed hands, my thumbs permanently stained black from oxidized soil. The crisp, clean paper felt entirely alien against my ruined skin. I would stare at the numbers, the accumulating debts, and feel absolutely nothing. The sickness had insulated me from the reality of the surface world. I simply folded the letters, shoved them into the pocket of my flannel jacket, and went back to the river. I believed, with a terrifying conviction of a madman, that one lucky strike would wipe the slate clean. But man cannot sustain his family on the jagged edge of a gamble. The end didn't arrive with a dramatic screaming match. It didn't come with shatter plates or slammed doors. It came with a suffocating, unbearable silence. The kind of quiet that rings in your ears and settles heavy in your lungs. Martha didn't fight me anymore, because there was nothing left to fight for. I had hollowed her out. I had taken the warm, vibrant woman who used to sing softly while she kneaded bread, and I had turned her into a ghost who flinched at the sound of my heavy boots on the porch. I remember the morning they left. It was a Tuesday in late October. The air was unnaturally still, the sky a flat, bruised gray that promised an early frost. I woke up on the sagging couch downstairs, having fallen asleep in my work clothes again. The house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the absolute absence of life. I walked into the hallway, my boots scuffing against the worn wood. The front door was standing open, letting in the biting autumn chill. I stepped onto the porch and watched as Martha loaded the last of the brown cardboard boxes into the bed of her rusted blue Ford pickup. She moved with a slow, mechanical efficiency, her shoulders hunched against the cold. She didn't look at me. She didn't curse me. She just tied down the tarp over their meager belongings, the rough twine biting into her pale hands. Leo was already in the truck. He was 14 then, a boy on the precarious edge of becoming a man, forced to grow up entirely too fast in the shadow of an absentee father. He was sitting in the passenger seat, his forehead pressed against the cold glass of the window. I stood there, paralyzed by the weight of my own failures, my jaw locked tight. I wanted to tell them to stop. I wanted to promise them that the next claim was the one, that the bedrock up near Miller's Creek was showing the right kind of quartz, that I was so close. But the words turned to ash in my throat. The sheer absurdity of the lie choked me. Martha closed the tailgate with a sharp, metallic clang that echoed through the empty pines. She walked around to the driver's side, opened the door, and paused for just a fraction of a second. She didn't turn around. She just got in and turned the ignition. As the truck sputtered to life, belching a cloud of blue exhaust into the pristine mountain air, Leo finally looked at me. He didn't look at me with the hot, burning anger I deserved. He looked at me with something far more devastating. It was pity. It was a hollow, confused gaze of a boy looking at a stranger, at a broken machine that no longer served a purpose. The tires crunched over the gravel of the driveway, the sound agonizingly slow. I stood motionless on the porch, feeling the cold seep into my bones, and watched the taillights of that battered Ford disappear around the bend. I watched until the dust settled back onto the road, until the sound of the engine was completely swallowed by the vast, uncaring wilderness. Then I turned around and walked back into the house. If you have never been completely alone in a house that used to hold everything you loved, you cannot comprehend the physical weight of that silence. It doesn't just fill the room, it crushes you. The air felt thick, heavy with the scent of lavender soap that was already beginning to fade, replaced by the damp, metallic rot of my own unwashed clothes. I walked into the kitchen. The stove was cold. A single coffee mug sat in the sink. I didn't break down. I didn't fall to my knees and weep. The tragic reality of hitting the bottom is that you rarely feel the impact right away. Instead, I walked over to the cabinet above the sink, reached past the empty spaces where Martha's plates used to sit, and pulled down a half-empty bottle of cheap bottom-shelf whiskey. I sat at the kitchen table, the wood scarred and stained, and poured the amber liquid into a dirty water glass. The smell of wet earth and pine needles that had defined my life for a decade was suddenly gone. In its place was the sharp, chemical sting of the alcohol and the coppery scent of the rusted tools piled in the corner of a room. I took a drink, letting the liquid burn a path down my throat, desperate for it to numb the creeping, icy realization that was wrapping around my chest. That was the true nature of the fall. It wasn't the loss of the house, or the insurmountable debt. The fall was sitting in that deafening silence, staring at the empty chair across the table, and realizing that there was absolutely no one left to blame but myself. When my wife and son disappeared down that dusty road, the lie I told myself in that echoing kitchen was this: when I find the mother lode, they'll all come back. But the universe does not reward the delusions of selfish gamblers, and I was about to learn that brutal, unforgiving truth on a freezing winter night that was fast approaching. The early 2000s crept into high country not with the bright fanfare of a new millennium, but with the quiet, suffocating weight of a long, unforgiving winter. By then, I was no longer a prospector. I was a ghost. I was an emaciated, hollowed-out specter haunting the very ridges that had stolen my soul. The mountain had chewed me up, extracted whatever youth and vitality I possessed, and spat out a broken shell of a man. My body, once a machine built for moving earth and crushing stone, was failing. The physical toll of decades spent submerged in freezing snowmelt and breathing in dust had finally come to collect its due. Every breath was a ragged, desperate negotiation with my own lungs, a wet, rattling wheeze that tasted perpetually of copper and old rust. My hands, the very instruments of my obsession, had betrayed me. The knuckles had swollen into gnarled, useless knots of cartilage, screaming with arthritic fire every time the temperature dropped. They were permanently hooked into a claw-like grip, customized by the universe solely for holding a pickaxe handle, and absolutely useless for anything else. I had retreated higher up the mountain, away from the mocking eyes of the valley below, living in a dilapidated, mold-eaten canvas tent that offered little more protection than a paper bag. And then the blizzard hit. It wasn't a standard winter squall. It was an apocalyptic, blinding whiteout that roared to the pines like a freight train, dropping the temperature so fast the sap froze and cracked the tree trunks like rifle shots in the dark. I was huddled on a thin, damp cot, wearing every piece of clothing I owned. The wind tore the canvas, the fabric snapping and whipping with a violent frenzy, threatening to rip my fragile shelter from its moorings and cast me out into the void. The cold in that tent wasn't merely the absence of heat. It was a living, breathing predator. It crawled up my legs, seeped through the soles of my worn boots, and sank its icy teeth directly into my bones. Hypothermia is a strange, deceptive killer. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It tells you that you are tired, that the best thing to do is just close your eyes for a moment. I knew with the primal instinct of a dying animal that if I didn't get a fire going in the small, rusted tin stove in the center of the tent, I would not wake up to see the morning. I dragged my shaking body off the cot and crawled across the frozen dirt floor. I gathered what little kindling I had left, damp twigs and shards of pine bark, and arranged them inside the stove. I reached into my coat pocket for my matches. My hands were vibrating so violently from the cold that I could barely pinch the small wooden sticks. I struck one against the box. It snapped. I tried another. It sparked, caught for a fraction of a second, and was immediately extinguished by a gust of wind that sliced through a tear in the canvas. Panic, raw and metallic, flooded my chest. I fumbled with a matchbox, the rough cardboard tearing to dry, cracked skin around my fingernails. Blood began to well up, a stark, vivid crimson against the freezing white of my skin, dripping onto the damp kindling. I struck another match. Another snap. My body was failing. My mind was narrowing down to a single, terrifying reality. I was going to die alone in the dirt, entirely forgotten. I looked frantically around the dim, freezing space. I had no dry paper. I had no moss. There was only one thing left in that tent that was completely dry, preserved in the bottom of an old tin footlocker that I had dragged up this mountain like a tombstone. With bleeding, trembling fingers, I pried open the lid. Inside, folded with meticulous care that belonged to a different lifetime, was a thick, heavy cardigan. Martha had knitted it for me during our first winter together, long before the fever had taken root. It was a deep, rich hunter green, made of thick wool that smelled faintly of cedar and the lavender soap she used to wash it. I remembered sitting by the hearth in our old house, watching her fingers move with a graceful, mesmerizing rhythm, weaving warmth out of nothing but yarn and love. It was the only pristine thing left in my existence. It was my last physical tether to the man I used to be. I held it in my ruined hands. The wool was impossibly soft against my split and callous skin. To burn it felt like committing a murder. It felt like choking the very last breath of the life I had destroyed. But the cold was tightening its grip around my throat, dimming the edges of my vision. I placed the green cardigan inside the rusted belly of the stove. I struck my final match. It flared to life. I touched the flame to the frayed edge of the wool. It didn't burn quickly. It smoldered first, sending a thick, acrid smoke into the tent, smelling of burning hair and lost memories. Then the fire caught. The flames licked upward, consuming the intricate stitches, turning the vibrant green into a blackened, curling mass. I knelt there on the frozen dirt, the heat finally beginning to radiate against my face, and I wept, not for the physical pain, but for the devastating clarity of what I was witnessing. As I watched the yarn catch fire, a profound, crushing realization hit me. I had spent decades looking for wealth in the mud, sifting through dirt to find something of value, completely blind to the fact that I was actively incinerating the only true treasures I had ever been given. I had burned my wife's love, my son's childhood, and my own dignity on the altar of a mountain that didn't even know my name. If you are watching this, and you have ever stared at the ceiling at 3 a.m., your heart pounding in the dark, wondering how you were going to survive tomorrow, hit that subscribe button, because this story is about the strength you never knew you had, and the brutal truth that sometimes you have to lose absolutely everything before you can see clearly. Stay with me. The fire kept me alive through the night, but it burned away the last shreds of my pride. When the gray, bruised light of dawn finally broke through the storm, the man who had thought he could conquer the Sierra Nevada was dead. I looked at the gray ash in the bottom of the stove. There was no gold there, just the pulverized remains of my own arrogance. I knew what I had to do. The storm had broken my body, but the fire had broken my ego. I packed nothing. I just wrapped my coat tighter, pushed open the tent flap, and began the agonizingly slow, humiliating descent toward the valley. The journey down from the mountain was not a return to civilization. It was a funeral march, and I was both the corpse and the pallbearer. The storm had spat me out, unworthy even of a freezing death in the dirt. When I finally reached the valley floor, the biting wind gave way to a damp, bone-deep chill. The small town of Oakhurst emerged from the dense fog like a judge's gavel, sharp, unforgiving, and terrifyingly real. I hadn't walked on paved asphalt in years. It felt unnaturally flat beneath my boots, abrasive and dead. The hum of the streetlights and the neon glow of a diner sign, buzzing in the pre-dawn mist, felt like an assault on my senses. I was a wild, feral thing, driven out of the timberline by starvation and the total collapse of my own delusions. I walked down Main Street with my chin tucked to my chest, actively avoiding the reflections in the storefront windows, because I knew the terrifying, hollow-eyed ghost that was waiting to look back at me. Survival, I learned, strips a man of the luxury of pride. I found myself standing in front of a sprawling, dimly lit establishment called Holloway's Hardware and Supply. It smelled of cut pine fertilizer and the sharp, chemical bite of WD-40. The owner, an old, quiet man with a bad limp, was unlocking the front doors. He took one look at my matted hair, my trembling, frostbitten hands, and the soot smeared across my face from the woolen cardigan I had burned to survive. He didn't ask for a resume. He didn't ask where I had come from. He just pointed a gnarled finger toward the back room, handed me a heavy canvas apron, and told me the pay was minimum wage, off the books. I didn't argue. I put the apron on. The heavy canvas smelled of industrial detergent and dust, and as I tied the strings behind my back, I felt a strange, profound weight settle over my shoulders. It was the weight of reality. For the next decade, that hardware store became my monastery. After spending half my adult life violently tearing the earth apart, blasting bedrock, diverting streams, and turning pristine riverbanks into muddy, apocalyptic craters, I was finally doing the exact opposite. I was putting things in order. My daily routine was a quiet, repetitive meditation. I unloaded trucks, sweeping the fine gray dust of Portland cement from the wooden floorboards. I sorted galvanized washers, hex nuts, and lag bolts into hundreds of tiny metal bins. Plunging my scarred, misshapen hands into a barrel of cold, zinc-plated nails sent a shock of absolute clarity through my nervous system. Every heavy, metallic clink of a bolt dropping into its rightful drawer was a tiny prayer of atonement. The mountain had been a chaotic, senseless gamble, a void that only took. But here, in the quiet aisles of Holloway's, there was undeniable, absolute order. Every tool had a purpose. Every screw belonged somewhere. But it wasn't a peaceful sanctuary. It was a place of deep, daily reckoning, particularly in Aisle 4. Aisle 4 was where we kept the excavation tools. Every Tuesday, it was my job to dust the inventory. I would walk down that row, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and stare at the pristine, varnished ash handles of the pickaxes and the smooth, black steel of the shovels. A visceral, choking hatred would rise in my throat. Just touching the cold, forged steel of a pickaxe had sent phantom pains shooting up my forearms. I remember the blisters, the bleeding cuticles, the desperate, psychotic rhythm of swinging that blade into the dirt. These weren't just tools hanging on a pegboard. To me, they were the murder weapons that had slaughtered my family. They were the physical manifestation of my arrogance. Sometimes I would grip the handle of a sledgehammer so tightly my arthritic knuckles would pop, fighting the overwhelming urge to smash every single gold pan we had in stock. Through those years, surrounded by the smell of machine oil and sawdust, my mind slowly cleared of the fever. I thought about Martha and Leo constantly. It was a dull, persistent ache in the center of my chest that no amount of cheap bourbon could numb anymore. The movies and the storybooks tell you a very specific, comfortable lie about redemption. They tell you that a man can find God or find his conscience, walk through the rain to his old front door, drop to his knees, and be forgiven. They tell you that a tearful apology washes away the past. It doesn't. I realized, slowly, while sweeping the aisles after closing time, that begging for forgiveness is often the most selfish act a man can commit. Forcing my way back into their lives just to alleviate my own crushing guilt would only bring the rot of my failures back to their doorstep. True penance wasn't about making myself feel better. True penance was carrying the agonizing weight of my isolation in absolute silence, ensuring that I never dragged my darkness into their light ever again. That realization solidified on a Tuesday in late May. I had managed to keep an old P.O. box in town, primarily to send whatever sparse dollars I could an old friend of Martha's, begging her only for word that they were alive and well. On this day, a thick, cream-colored envelope was waiting for me. I took it to the back room of the hardware store, sitting on an overturned bucket of joint compound. My hands were shaking so badly I tore the envelope opening it. Inside was a single, glossy photograph. It was Leo. He was a man now. He was standing on a manicured green lawn in front of a grand brick building, wearing a dark blue graduation gown. The sun was shining on his face, catching the bright, genuine smile that he had inherited entirely from his mother. He looked healthy. He looked whole. He looked like a man who had survived the crater his father had left behind. When I held that photo, my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I stood up, kicking the bucket aside. I took a step toward the back door, ready to walk to the station, buy a bus ticket, and go to him. I wanted to stand in the back of whatever crowd was celebrating him and just look at him with my own eyes. Then I stopped. I looked down at my hands, holding the photograph. The grease and black silt of the mountain were permanently tattooed into my deep calluses. I smelled the heavy metallic stench of machine oil, rust, and sweat radiating off my apron. I realized, with a clarity that brought me my knees, that I had no right to drag my selfish, ruined hands through his clean, beautiful world. I had made my choice years ago in the freezing mud of the Sierra Nevada. I was walking down to the very town I had sworn to return to as a king, ready to swallow my pride and beg for my life. But the true reckoning, the one that required more courage than surviving a winter storm, was waiting for me in the dusty aisles of a hardware store, right at the bottom of the mountain. I carefully placed the photograph inside my rusted metal locker and slowly closed the door. I found where true redemption was hidden. It was in the deafening, heartbreaking silence of that store's back room. Choosing to remain a ghost so my son could finally live. Time behaves differently when you stop trying to outrun it. Up on the mountain, time was a hostile force, a ticking stopwatch counting down the days until the ground froze and the snows buried my delusions. But down in the valley, inside the dust-filtered light of Holloway's hardware, time became a slow, steady metronome. The rhythmic ticking of the oversized analog clock above the cash register didn't taunt me. It grounded me. 15 years passed in the quiet aisles of that store. I crossed the threshold of my 70s not with a grand celebration, but with a quiet realization that it took longer to unlace my boots every evening. The arthritis in my hands had settled into a permanent, dull ache, a calcified reminder of the rivers that had ruined me. My hair went from coarse iron gray to a stark, brittle white. I became an invisible fixture of the town, just another old man in a canvas apron smelling of sweeping compound and rusted pipe fittings. And for the first time in my miserable life, I was entirely at peace with my own insignificance. I was no longer Arthur Callahan, the man who was going to conquer the Sierra Nevada. I was just Arthur, the man who knew exactly which drawer held the 3/4-inch brass washers. There's a profound, uncelebrated dignity in earning a minimum wage when you have spent your life gambling with the universe. Every Friday at 4 o'clock, old Mr. Holloway would hand me a small, thin paper envelope containing my weekly pay in cash. It wasn't a fortune. It was barely enough to cover the rent on my cramped trailer on the edge of town and keep my pantry stocked with generic coffee and canned soup. But that small stack of worn, limp bills was the most honest money I had ever held. It wasn't ripped from the earth on a false promise. It was an equitable trade, my time, my sore back, and my remaining strength in exchange for existence. There was no motherlode, no jackpot, no fever, just the simple, brutal honesty of arithmetic. But I didn't keep all of it. Every Friday afternoon, before the bank closed, I would take off my canvas apron, wash the grease from my forearms in the utility sink, and walk 3 blocks down Main Street to the post office. I had established a routine that became my sole religion. Through the quiet network of old acquaintances I dared not contact directly, I had learned a few years back that Leo had a son. I had a grandson, a boy whose face I had never seen, whose voice I had never heard, and whose life I had absolutely no right to be a part of. I would stand at a high wooden counter at the post office, my gnarled, misshapen fingers gripping a cheap blue ballpoint pen. Slowly, agonizingly, I would fill out an anonymous cashier's check. $200. Sometimes less if the heating bill at the trailer was high, but never nothing. I would write the routing number of the college trust fund that had been set up in his name, slip the check into a plain manila envelope, and drop it into the brass mail slot. I never included a note. I never wrote a return address. To attach my name to that money would have been a catastrophic act of selfishness. It would have been a demand for recognition, a silent plea for absolution. That money was an apology. You cannot buy your way out of the purgatory you built with your own hands. That envelope was a tax on my soul. It was a transmutation of my sweat and my remaining time into a foundation for a boy I would never hold. It was the only pure thing I had ever produced in 70-odd years on this earth. The rest of my days were spent behind the scarred wooden counter of the hardware store, watching the world pass by in a parade of broken hinges and stripped screws. Occasionally, a young buck would come in. They always looked the same. Fresh flannel shirts, boots that had never seen real mud, and a restless, frantic energy vibrating in their jaws. They would buy heavy-duty chainsaws, sledgehammers, or prospecting pans, their eyes wide with the intoxicating illusion that they were going to tear a fortune out of the local timber or the riverbeds. I recognized that look instantly. It was a fever. One afternoon, a kid no older than Leo was when he left, slammed a brand-new, forged steel pickaxe onto my counter. He was practically vibrating with impatience. Talking loud and fast about a quartz vein, he'd scouted up near the county line, bragging about how he was going to bypass the hard labor and dynamite the bedrock to get to the gold faster. I slowly picked up the tool. My scarred, blackened thumb ran over the smooth, varnished ash of the handle. I looked at his hands, soft, unblemished, ignorant of the permanent damage that cold steel inflicts on human bone. I didn't preach to him. I didn't tell him about the canvas tent, or the burning sweater, or the echoing silence of an empty kitchen. I just scanned the barcode, met his eager, arrogant eyes, and slid the heavy tool back across the counter. "The mountain doesn't care how fast you swing, son," I said, my voice like dry gravel grinding under a tire. "It only cares if the blade is true. You try to blast your way to the finish line. You're just going to bury everything worth keeping under the rubble. Take your time. The dirt ain't going anywhere." He just blinked at me, a polite, dismissive smirk on his face, grabbed his receipt, and hurried out the door toward his gleaming new truck. You can't teach a drowning man how to swim by yelling from the shore. He had to hit the water first. I went back to sorting the nails, letting the metallic clink, clink, clink soothe the rising tide of my memories. Every Friday when I mailed that nameless envelope, the old, dark hunger in my chest quieted just a fraction of an inch more. The routine was my anchor, the ticking clock my only companion. I thought I had found my permanent purgatory, a quiet place to run out the clock until my body finally quit. Taki o Gyunkatter. It was a Tuesday evening in late October, raining hard, the kind of cold, driving rain that washes the grease right off the asphalt. I was just about to flip the neon open sign to closed and turn the deadbolt. The brass bell above the door chimed, cutting through the low hum of the fluorescent lights. A figure stepped out of the freezing rain and into the warm, cedar-scented air of the shop. I looked up from the register, my hand frozen on the key. He was older, soaked to the bone, staring at the rack of excavation tools in aisle 4. When he finally turned his head and looked at me across the empty store, the breath completely evaporated from my lungs. The man standing in the doorway dripping rainwater onto the scarred floorboards of Holloway's hardware wasn't a ghost, though he looked like one. It was Elias Vance. 2 decades ago, we had stood shoulder to shoulder, waist deep in the freezing current of the Yuba River, our eyes burning with the exact same sickness. Now he was a hollowed-out shell, his shoulders hunched, his skin the color of old parchment drawn tight over a skull. His hands shook as he brought a heavy forged pickaxe to the counter. He didn't recognize me. The fever had burned away his ability to truly see anything that didn't glitter. To him, I was just another anonymous old man in a canvas apron, a background fixture in a world he was only using to resupply his delusions. He paid in crumpled, damp bills, coughing a deep, rattling sound that I knew intimately. It was the sound of a man whose lungs were filled with mountain dust and regret. I watched him walk back out into the freezing rain, clutching that pickaxe like it was a lifeline, completely unaware that he was carrying his own anchor. I locked the deadbolt behind him, turned off the neon sign, and felt profound, overwhelming silence wash over me. I was finally completely free. That was a few years ago. Today, the hardware store is just a memory, and I am 76 years old. I spend my evenings on the small, sagging wooden porch of a corrugated tin trailer on the far edge of town. The wood creaks under my weight, a familiar, comforting sound of things settling into their rightful place. The air up here, just below the timberline, smells different in the evening. It smells of damp pine needles, cooling asphalt, and the sharp, clean bite of the coming night. I sit in a cheap woven lawn chair, nursing a mug of black coffee that has long since gone cold, and I watch the sky. My body is a roadmap of my failures. The arthritis in my hands has twisted my knuckles into thick, gnarled burls of bone. Some mornings, it takes me 10 minutes just to work the stiffness out of my knees enough to stand. My breath whistles in my chest, a permanent souvenir from the damp canvas tents and the icy water. But when I look down at these ruined hands, I don't feel the choking hatred I used to feel in aisle 4. The grease and the black silt are gone. They are just the hands of an old man who finally learned how to build instead of destroy. As the sun dips below the jagged ridge of the Sierra Nevada, the sky begins its daily transformation. It bleeds from a bruised, violent purple into a soft, glowing amber. It is the exact color of the dust I spent my entire life tearing the earth apart to find. For decades, I looked for that color in the mud. I dug for it in the dark, cold belly of the mountain, surrounded by dirt and isolation. I thought that if I could just hold enough of it in my palm, it would buy me respect, love, and a shield against the world. But looking up at the sky now, washing the entire valley in a blinding, radiant gold, I realized the absolute absurdity of my life's work. The only gold that ever mattered was freely given, draped across the horizon for any man willing to simply look up. It warms the face. It asks for no blood, no sweat, and no fractured families. Earlier today, I took my final walk down to the post office. My grandson turned 22 this week. The trust fund I had been quietly feeding 20, 50, sometimes $200 at a time, had matured. The bank teller, a kind woman who has watched me hobble in there for 15 years, handed me the final confirmation receipt. I folded it carefully, slipped it into my worn leather wallet, and walked out into the afternoon sun. My debt wasn't paid. You can never truly balance the scales of a ruined family. But my work was done. I had laid the final brick in a foundation I would never stand on. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the wind rustle through the high branches of the sugar pines. The air is growing cold, but there's a strange, profound warmth radiating from the center of my chest. It is an emptiness, but not the terrifying, echoing emptiness of that kitchen I stood in 20 years ago. It is the emptiness of a ledger finally closed. It is the peace of a man who has surrendered his pride. When I was young, I thought time was a river. I thought it was like the freezing current of the American River or the Yuba, constantly rushing, churning, flowing away, but always renewing itself from some endless glacier upstream. I thought if you missed an opportunity, if you stayed out in the woods a little too long, the river would just bring you another chance tomorrow. I was a damn fool. Time doesn't renew itself. It only flows in one direction, and it never, ever comes back. The hours I spent shivering in a sluice box while my son grew up without a father are gone. The days I spent studying bedrock while my wife learned how to be entirely alone are gone. You cannot take a pan to the river of time and sift out the moments you threw away. Nothing buried under the dirt, no quartz vein, no mother lode, no nugget the size of your fist, is more valuable than the people sitting at your dinner table. Now, I am an old man sitting in the dark. I have a rusted trailer, a cold cup of coffee, and arthritic hands. I don't have a single speck of gold in my pocket. I don't have a legacy that will be written in history books. But that lightness I feel in my chest right now, the quiet rhythm of my own heart beating in a peaceful chest. Believe me, boys, I wouldn't trade that for all the gold in the world. If my journey reminded you of the scars that made you who you are, share this video, subscribe, and leave a piece of your own survival story in the comments. Time is a strict teacher. I'll see you. It was a face I hadn't seen in over 2 decades, walking in from the storm, looking for an old pickaxe.